We have our Chief Political Correspondent, Paul Sakkal, as usual, and Federal Political Correspondent, Natassia Chrysanthos. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
Morning.
So, Paul, last weekend we saw these big anti-immigration rallies being held across the country. They were called the March for Australia rallies. They made the news, obviously, and there was particularly some violence at the Melbourne rally where we saw neo-Nazis showing up, and one was even sort of given permission to take the microphone and publicly address the rally in a sort of endorsement almost of that particular group. And this was despite an insistence from the organisers that the rallies were attended by mainstream Australians. What reaction did we see this week from Canberra?
Yeah, they were big rallies. I mean, they weren't as violent or as incendiary as the Cronulla riots, but they certainly carried echoes of it in terms of the size and the tenor of some of the debate at these rallies. In terms of how the reaction played out in Canberra this week, the Prime Minister was particularly keen to strike a measured tone. He wanted to acknowledge the legitimate concerns of some of the people at the rally.
Do you think there were good people with legitimate concerns at these anti-immigration rallies this weekend?
Of course, there's always good people will turn up to demonstrate their views about particular issues. But what we have here is neo-Nazis being given a platform.
He didn't want to cast them all as extremists. He wanted to acknowledge that there has been high migration post-COVID after a period of low migration when lockdowns occurred, which coincided with a housing crisis and people feeling like their lot in life was getting worse. We had an inflation crisis as well. So you saw Albanese trying to kind of sit in the middle of this debate. Susan Lee tried to set the agenda earlier in the week by saying that the Prime Minister needed to show leadership at this time of kind of fraying of our social fabric. But the coalition's message got muddied as the week went on because some of the more forceful right-wingers in the party, including Jacinta Price and Alex Antic, used some, at times, controversial language to talk about this issue. Jacinta Price draped herself in the Australian flag, which is the garb that many of these protesters were using on Sunday. Alex Antic, the most far-right Liberal senator, suggested that the neo-Nazi group led by Thomas Sewell, who we saw harass Jacinta Allen, the Victorian Premier, at a press conference, was effectively in some sort of PSYOP operation with ASIO, and they're not a real organisation, and this is all a government set up to try and create the impression that neo-Nazis are a prominent force when actually anti-migration views are widespread. So there were some out-there comments in the Parliament this week, and worth just very briefly putting it into a bigger context. We've had the ASIO boss Mike Burgess talking for years about the increased risk of politically motivated violence at the same time as populist movements are on the rise in the US with Trump and in large parts of Europe. All of these extremist elements and these risks we've been hearing a lot about are kind of coalescing and creating this big national conversation around radicalism in Australia.
Yeah, and sort of some elements are hopping off the internet and into real life. Tass, you had a look at immigration figures this week, so let's just go straight to the facts, because there is this perception, rightly or wrongly, among some sectors of the Australian population that there are too many migrants. And particularly in our big cities where you do see a lot of, I think, probably temporary migrants, and people blame them perhaps for the housing crisis and also maybe for sort of infrastructure gluts or kind of, jamming up infrastructure. What are the actual facts on our migration figures?
Well, if you look at the last 2 decades, so since about 2004 in the Howard era, you've had a pretty steady approach to migration where the population has generally grown between 1% and 2% every year. And since 2004, migrants have contributed more to population growth than natural increase, which refers to the number of people being born minus the number of people who died. So migrants have made up the kind of majority of population growth for the last 20 years. The big anomaly, I suppose, as Paul said, happened during COVID. So we were on track at that kind of steady rate of growth between 1% and 2%. Then borders were shut. You had this historic dip in migration to negative migration. And then when borders reopened, you had a historic surge. Now, when kind of people in the protests have, and it happens in Parliament as well, bring up this argument that 1 million people came into the country in 2 years. That's true. But what that doesn't kind of account for was it came off the back of negative migration. And actually the budget papers, so the budget papers forecast migration for the next 4 years, every year. And they've gotten all muddled up with all these kind of contradictory expectations, not being able to predict when borders will open or close, things like that. But, for example, if you go back to the 2019 budget delivered by the Morrison government, which is the last pre-COVID budget, I suppose, and you look at its forecast for population growth, which was a kind of steady rate, and you take that forward, the population would have been in 2024, it would have been almost 28 million. What we ended up with was 27.4 million. So the population levels that we see now are roughly on par with what governments were supposedly planning for 5-6 years ago. So that's when you get to this kind of argument that governments have been ushering in this kind of mass migration by stealth. That doesn't add up when you look at what governments have been planning for. And then you get into a reasonable debate about housing and infrastructure and all of that.
So basically COVID kind of really stuffed everything up, and I think that or stuffed up all the projections. Okay, so Paul, let's talk about the political debate around migration, because as you say, it has become sort of globalised. Both Labor and the Coalition know that some voters have concerns around there being too much immigration, and both parties went to the election with promises to cut immigration. That obviously didn't work so well for the Coalition, but Labor's won government. Are they going to cut immigration?
Yeah, well, Labor's continuing on with their policies that they had before the last election to bring immigration down from those post-COVID highs. Peter Dutton turned this into one of the most salient issues of the last term. Not off his own bat, he picked up on something that was occurring in the community. I'm interested to ask, I'll maybe ask now, is it right to say that the post-COVID numbers did lead to a much higher perception of high immigration and a perception that immigrants were fueling social issues in Australia? Or is that a bigger feature of political debate than it has been in polling of individuals?
I think it depends who you are and where you live, right, and what your economic concerns are. I think research tells us that people who are concerned about economic security or housing insecurity are more likely to be concerned about immigration. You had in this recent period that really intersect with the housing debate, but in previous times, you've got traffic and congestion issues, and that also turns into a conversation about immigration. So I think everyone's kind of reality on that front will be different, but there's no doubt that the political narrative, I think, has helped to kind of consolidate that argument. And I think that housing immigration link, there's a relationship there, but immigration is not the only factor that influences housing shortages, housing prices. It's a much more complicated picture to do with. What I find really interesting, is just talking to people in Parliament, including Coalition ministers, MPs, post-election. And a lot of them will say, people didn't buy it. Like we were drawing this simplistic link being like immigration, migrants and international students are the reasons you can't buy a house. And it didn't land with people. And I think you saw that in the election result, which is why I find it quite interesting that the Coalition in many ways this week is still kind of giving this conversation a similar framing.
The Coalition leadership tried to strike a pretty even tone on this stuff, but we did see Coalition Senator Jacqueline Maley make some particularly sort of controversial comments about the Indian community in particular that she got backlash on.
So you've got kind of Lee, I think, trying to play both sides a little bit, being very kind of much more empathetic, kind of we're all migrants, I'm a migrant, we love the migrant communities, while at the same time kind of weighing into this debate around the housing link, which didn't quite work for the Coalition last time. And then as she's really trying to walk that line, you've got Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who comes on afternoon briefing, and after a bit of questioning from the host, basically alleges that Labor is bringing in specific groups of migrants so that it can win votes. Now, Australia's got a non-discriminatory migration system that doesn't preference nationality, but Price basically contradicts that, and then when pressed on who is Labor trying to bring in, singles out the Indian community, who were already, and this is probably worth acknowledging, the overwhelming kind of target in terms of anti-immigration sentiment on the weekend, and you have several really upsetting reports of racism that people experienced on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and so forth. And then you have Price, now a Liberal senator, going on national television and basically validating that concern that led to significant racism on our streets.
And not just that, saying that they're queue jumpers almost.
Yeah, and the Labor is vote stacking, and no kind of credible allegation, no evidence for it. I think it's safe to say that Lee wasn't happy about that situation. Price had issued a statement about an hour afterwards. But again, her statement was, Australia has a non-discriminatory migration program. Suggestions otherwise are a mistake. There wasn't a kind of a lot of ownership over that mistake, and no apology. And then she came out the next day and said, "I don't think I need to apologise." So and the Indian community, it is a significant voting bloc because it's a lot of people, and Labor and the Coalition both court that community. There is a lot of active outreach among Indian Australians, and a lot of them are very politically engaged. So I don't think this bodes well for the Coalition and Susan Lee as she vows to rebuild the Coalition's reputation in multicultural communities that ultimately contributed to its massive defeat.
I just want to look at the overseas context first, because we do look overseas and we see that in the UK, in the United States, in Germany, just to name a few countries, there is some fraying of social cohesion that is due to conflict over migration, I guess you could say, and tensions. And you have xenophobic protests against asylum seekers in the United Kingdom, for example. Paul, are Australian politicians sort of very concerned or very alive to the possibility that that kind of stuff could be imported here?
Well, I think they definitely are. And on a number of different fronts in politics now, you see the internet kind of shrinking the world.
Yeah.
Movements that pop up in a like-minded Western country can very quickly be replicated by people in another country because they're able to pick up the same tactics and talking points. And you see that from the US. You're seeing that now. Some of the UK protests that have occurred in small towns in the UK looked a little bit like the ones we saw on the weekend here.
Yeah.
There was a huge online discussion in Australia about the so-called UK migrant gang rape crisis, which quickly turned into an issue last year because of its prominence on Elon Musk's platform. And then I saw lots of Australian far-right debate just in the weeks after that. So you're seeing this kind of aping of events overseas. And I think just a point of difference between us and some of these other countries is what we've been able to do in terms of securing our borders over the last 20 years. John Howard used to talk about keeping control of borders and keeping public kind of acceptance of the migration program alive. And key to that is stopping the sense that the borders are porous and that small boats are flowing in without any control, which feeds a sense of anxiety in the community. He brought in the Pacific solution. Labor obviously overturned that, had a huge political crisis over it under the Rudd-Gillard governments, reluctantly brought back stronger border policies. Yeah, the Abbott government brought in boat turnback policies, and now that's an absolute fixture of Labor politics, as demonstrated by Tony Burke last week signing another very expensive deal with Nauru. So we do have a fundamental difference with, for example, the UK, which has a very, very porous border at its English Channel crossing. But we are seeing on the fringes of our society, not quite in the centre as it is in other parts of the West, but on the fringes, a growing sense that there are too many migrants in our community, that certain pockets of particularly Melbourne and Sydney are starting to not look like Australia, that white Australians, particularly lower middle class and working class white Australians, don't have prosperous lives because heavy industries have closed, because the fossil fuel industry is dying, and that the globalisation that we've seen in the last 30 years has not benefited some groups of Australians, and that we've used high levels of migration to grow our economy instead of trying to find solutions to actually grow productivity.
Yeah, so that's what I find interesting, because as you've just taken us through a potted history of the sort of asylum seeker debate, which was a huge issue. Like when I was in Canberra, it was a huge political issue, and it's basically settled, and it's basically bipartisan now that we have a very quote unquote strong border protection policy. But now the debate has actually shifted to completely legal migration, migration that is sanctioned and indeed encouraged by our government to prop up economic growth and to prop up the population. But I suppose you see a whole cohort of voters who feel like they've never signed on to that, who feel like they've never specifically agreed to having these levels of what, the right wingers call mass immigration, which is not a term that I would use. But I guess what I'm getting at is whether or not both sides of politics, and now Labor because they're in government, have actually done enough to proactively convince or show Australians the benefits of migration to our country in terms of services, in terms of population growth, in terms of economic growth, and specialised workers that we desperately need.
I feel like a lot of Australians do get that. I think most Australians do get that. I think most people have, but I think it's
in the centre
it's
of politics,
interesting.
Yeah.
Is it being led by politicians though, and particularly to the cohort of Australians who feel that they're maybe getting a bit ripped off by the immigration system as it is?
I wonder when we're talking about that cohort of people, and I think recent surveys will tell us, there is a kind of higher level than usual of concern about immigration as a trend in Australia. Whether that whole group of people are the kind of people who are so motivated by that concern that they'd come out and march, I don't know. I think I kind of, just like putting it in perspective a bit, I feel like this cohort is a group of people. I think other people have kind of less passionate feelings perhaps about the rate of immigration, even if there is a level of underlying discomfort or whatnot. But I feel like that cohort, probably the ones that, turned up to the rally, I don't feel like their kind of views on this thing are really being guided by mainstream politicians. Like it's coming more from like the right wing.
Yeah, sure. And I think a lot of it is, as we say, a lot of it's influenced by internet culture. The onus on politicians to make proactively a case for immigration and its benefits. Have they failed?
I feel like and hearing them talk about this week, right? Everyone will be like, everyone's a migrant. Migrants have made great contributions to our country, et cetera, et cetera. Whether it's that line's not convincing or it feels a bit basic at this point, whether it's a matter of being more upfront when it comes to policy platforms at elections around your forecasts around immigration, so people feel like they're on the same page and that the government's justifying.
And the government hid its migration numbers for months and just released it quietly this week.
I don't think that's quite.
I mean, and the reality is that most ordinary voters aren't going to be looking at the migration projections in the budget papers. But I just wonder if there's a little bit of reticence on the part of politicians from both sides of politics to admit how much immigration drives economic growth. And how much we need and desperately rely upon migrants, in particular in sectors like the aged care industry and in healthcare generally, and even in industries like financial services, where I think it's about a quarter of workers are from overseas. So, I just wonder if they're a little bit reluctant to admit that publicly. Paul, I want to ask about the neo-Nazis that we saw in Melbourne this week, which strangely seems to be, I don't know, a comfortable home for neo-Nazis.
Can I just jump in the point you just made? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
Can I just,
go ahead.
Just make one more? Yeah, I do think there is reluctance, because if you're a treasurer and you've just gone through a period of really damp economic growth, only kept out of recession by high migration levels, you're effectively admitting that without bringing in a lot of migrants, you have run the economy into the ground. So we've had uncreative policy making and a lack of bravery in policy making, which has created a productivity problem that's been where a gap has been plugged by migration. And just this week, we saw how crucial, and you mentioned aged care, Jackie, how crucial migrant workers are, because the government delayed home care packages in aged care, created a bit of a mini crisis in Canberra this week, forcing the government to backtrack and roll out aged care home packages more quickly. And a key reason the government cited for not being able to care for people in their homes is that we don't have enough workers in Australia willing to do these jobs. We need more migration to plug these skills gaps. So for all the concern about housing, legitimate or not, there's a lot of concern on the other side around skill shortages, which we saw in COVID and we still see now in a bunch of key industries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Peter Dutton in particular, when they had their sort of big targets to slash migration that they took to the election, never really addressed the difficulty of the fact that the economy basically wasn't going to run, on the levels of migration that he was.
It was a totally incoherent policy from Dutton with no solution on how that would work economically.
Yeah. So let's talk about the neo-Nazis, as reluctant as I am to give them any airtime. We did see them surface in Melbourne. We saw a neo-Nazi leader bail up Jacinta Allen, the Victorian Premier, at a press conference in a public place, which was a little bit of a security risk. How can politicians, or how are the politicians at a federal level responding to this sort of creep of extremism into the mainstream debate, Tars?
You see, for example, the Prime Minister grappling with this in his tone and remarks this week. This very careful, there are good people, we don't want to demonise everyone. He was pressed on this in the caucus as well, because not all Labor MPs were satisfied with that response. Ed Husick came out a few days later and said, I think something like, will show me a good fascist. The Prime Minister's justification was that it goes, I guess, back to the kind of internet radicalisation theme, which is by demonising these people publicly, you could push them into a rabbit hole. And I think the other big thing that counter-extremism experts will say when it comes to right-wing radical groups is, and we saw this around Welcome to Country, around Anzac Day as well, they are trying to hijack mainstream debate. They are making what sounds like rational argument to kind of bring people more into a racist and extremist ideology. I think you've seen the Prime Minister be very cautious about playing into their hand there. I think that is what is also probably a bit interesting about the way that the coalition has responded. Like the coalition, I think where the Labor government has tried to move on from a legitimate discussion of immigration this week. It's acknowledged it, but it hasn't wanted to engage with it. You've seen the coalition engage with it more. You had One Nation try and launch a Senate inquiry into immigration. The coalition then kind of jumped on that and amended it slightly, also trying to call for this debate into immigration. Where that all started was with these weekend rallies, which we saw were hijacked by neo-Nazi groups. So I think there are different levels of kind of caution around the parliament in terms of how political debate should or should not engage with that kind of extremist element to some of these conversations taking place.
They're so in your face, and it is, and it's and I think media is grappling with this in the same way. Like they're so in your face and so disgusting that it demands attention, but they would be nothing without the attention.
It's a phenomenon that exists. But I don't want to talk about neo-Nazis on this podcast ever if I had my druthers.
No. And they have there's a document from 2021 which Cam Wilson from Crikey reported. It's from the National Socialist Network, so the group that Thomas Sewell runs, and it's a handbook on, quote, media baiting. And it quotes, "Media baiting is a huge portion of our recruitment drive. There are currently hundreds of minor nationalist groups in Australia, but none of them ever amount to anything without media attention. Even if the articles are mostly negative, the readers of the article are not the target audience. We're trying to win over youth who are already sympathetic to the cause and are seeking an outlet for their views." So inadvertently, we are driving their recruitment.
We're being used as tools. All right, let's stop talking about neo-Nazis then. Guys, this has been such an interesting discussion. I wish we could talk for longer, but we're out of time. And I'm sure we'll revisit it. Tass, particular thanks to you. We haven't seen you in a while. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.